On this Thursday night, former U.S. President Trump subpoenaed new damning evidence from the committee investigating the U.S. Capitol riot.
The central cause of January 6th was one man.
And stunning video released from that day, congressional leaders pleading for help. Ottawa's use of the Emergencies Act under scrutiny.
Were those actions appropriate?
Why some provinces say no. Cases of COVID-19 climb again, your best defense, according to doctors. Plus, a father and son's unbreakable bond and love for hockey.
We were given the 6 months.
The heartwarming story that could melt the coldest rink.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. We begin with big developments in Washington at the committee hearing into the January 6th attempted insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. Some stunning, previously unseen video was released. It shows congressional leaders, including House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, being rushed to a secure room while the building was under siege, as she makes calls and scrambles to try to end the violence.
There has to be some way we can maintain the sense that people have that there's some security or some confidence that government can function and that we can elect the President of the United States. Did we go back into session?
We did go back into session, but now apparently everybody on the floor is putting on tear gas masks to prepare for a breach. I'm trying to get more information.
They're putting on their
tear gas masks.
I can't. We need an area for the House members. They're all walking over now through the tunnels.
Pelosi and others wanted to ensure the vote to certify that election result took place that day, and it eventually did, despite the storming of the Capitol. There was testimony, too, about how chillingly close former President Donald Trump got to leading the crowd to the Capitol, and that he, his inner circle, and the Secret Service knew about the potential for violence. The committee has built a case that all roads lead to the former president, and today it voted to subpoena documents and testimony from Trump. Jackson Proskow on the dramatic culmination of a year-and-a-half-long investigation.
Cheney, aye. Ms. Lofgren?
Aye.
In a unanimous decision, the January 6th committee voted to subpoena the man they blame for the events of that day, former President Donald Trump.
We must seek the testimony under oath of January 6th central player.
What we are being told very directly is it's going to take days for the Capitol to be okay again.
The vote came after the committee revealed harrowing new footage of congressional leaders hiding during the attack, pleading for help from government officials.
Why don't you get the president to tell them to leave the Capitol, Mr. Attorney General, in your law enforcement responsibility? A public statement they should all leave.
Mr. Schiff?
Aye. There were no new witnesses, but more new evidence of Trump's plot to ignore the will of voters and stay in power.
President Trump had a premeditated plan to declare that the election was fraudulent and stolen before Election Day, before he knew the election results.
The committee outlined how Trump and his allies hatched their scheme well in advance. First, denial.
And what Trump's going to do is just declare victory, right? He's going to declare victory. But that doesn't mean he's the winner.
Then the lies from a man who knew he had lost.
There were more votes than there were voters.
Donald Trump maliciously repeated this nonsense to a wide audience over and over again. His intent was to deceive.
For the first time, the committee revealed some of the 1 million pieces of evidence unearthed from the Secret Service. Agents knew days in advance of threats from armed Trump supporters. On January 6th, Secret Service agents shared warnings that the violent mob was acting at the behest of Trump.
After Trump's tweet, one agent in the Secret Service's intelligence division immediately warned, POTUS just tweeted about Pence, probably not going to be good for Pence.
Now, regardless of whether or not Trump ultimately testifies, the committee itself faces some real time constraints on its work. Midterm elections, of course, are less than 4 weeks away. The end of the year ends the term of this committee. The committee says they're working on a final written report. We should point out, though, Donna, that the Justice Department is not constrained by any elections, and the committee said today they have enough evidence for multiple criminal referrals to the Justice Department.
All right, Jackson Proskow in Washington, thank you. In Ottawa, the use of the Federal Emergencies Act in February is under scrutiny. That probe was triggered automatically when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau invoked the act. He says it was necessary to clear the hundreds of protesters and vehicles that occupied streets near Parliament Hill for weeks and at some border crossings. The judge heading the inquiry says what's at stake is public confidence in government.
The exercise by government of the exceptional powers given to it by the Emergencies Act affects directly or indirectly all Canadians. I'm confident that the hearings will provide a fair and thorough process for the presentation of evidence required for this commission to be able to give the public the answers to which it is entitled.
The inquiry will hear from dozens of witnesses and is operating on a tight timeline. Eric Sorensen looks at what came from day one of the highly anticipated inquiry.
On the very street occupied 8 months ago, a public inquiry will hear from more than 60 witnesses as to how it was brought to an end.
I'm looking forward to testifying, and I'm happy to be here.
From protesters like Tamara Leach all the way to the Prime Minister. For more than 3 weeks last winter, the streets of Ottawa were choked. Horns blared and residents were left afraid and desperate. Both police planning and inaction is under scrutiny, as is the use of crowdfunding for protesters. There were blockades near Canada's largest U.S. border crossing in Windsor. But the inquiry commissioner says his primary focus is squarely on the federal government's decision itself to invoke the Emergency Measures Act.
Why did it declare an emergency? How did it use its powers? And were those actions appropriate?
In a rare move, the federal government is releasing some normally privileged documents to demonstrate its actions were a last resort.
It was a reasonable and necessary decision, given the escalating, volatile, and urgent circumstances across the country.
But was it urgent across the country? In Alberta, road blockades were cleared before the Emergency Act passed. The province told Ottawa it did not want to see emergency powers.
The existing law enforcement tools that were already in place were completely sufficient.
The Prime Minister called premiers to consult, but Saskatchewan suggests it wasn't genuine, coming hours before the act was invoked.
The call was not so much about consulting as it was about telling.
The events of last winter will be presented through conflicting prisms. Demonstrators who say it was a lawful protest, the police who say it was violent.
The situation became volatile, and it required an unprecedented response.
By mandate, the inquiry must conclude by February, just 1 year after the protests. Inquiries such as Air India spanned up to 4 years. But it's perhaps the Gomery inquiry that draws political parallels. Then Prime Minister Paul Martin and his predecessor Jean Chrétien testified over sponsorships that severely damaged the Liberal government's popularity. One difference, government actions this time played out largely in public and were defended by the current Prime Minister.
That's why I'm so happy to be, that I offered from the beginning to be part of appearing at this commission.
Tomorrow, the first witnesses will begin testifying about what happened in those 3 turbulent weeks around Parliament Hill last winter. Eric Sorensen, Global News.
Ontario's Special Investigation Unit says the 2 police officers killed on Tuesday night had not drawn their guns when they were shot. Constables Devon Northrup and Morgan Russell were shot at a home in Innisfil, north of Toronto. A third officer did fire on the suspect, who died at the scene. Police say they seized an SKS semi-automatic rifle. The Department of Defense has confirmed the suspect, 23-year-old Chris Doncaster, was a private in the armed forces from May to December of 2020, but left prior to completing his basic training. In Florida, a gunman who killed 17 people at a high school in Parkland will spend the rest of his life in jail. The jury spared 24-year-old Nicholas Cruz the death penalty, sentencing him to life in prison without parole. Cruz stormed Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School on Valentine's Day in 2018, opening fire with a rifle. The jury could not unanimously agree on a death sentence. The victims' families packed the courtroom today, some shaking their heads, others wiping away tears. They say they're angry, devastated, and that the jury failed them. Cruz will be formally sentenced November 1st. Now to the war in Ukraine. Russia's nuclear threat was front and center at a meeting of NATO defense ministers today. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg warned of severe consequences if Russia launches a nuclear strike.
And we will not go into exactly how we will respond, but of course this will fundamentally change the nature of the conflict. It will mean that a very important line has been crossed.
The head of the UN nuclear watchdog is back in Ukraine to establish a safety zone around the nuclear plant in Zaporizhzhia. Sirens wailed across the country after a fourth straight day of Russian bombardment. More than 36 people have been killed since airstrikes have intensified. As Crystal Goomansingh reports, there is an intense effort to save people.
Piles of concrete, shards of metal, and heaps of pain. Those living in Mykolaiv are no strangers to the sights of war. Surviving each day here is often boiled down to luck. The wall here is gone. 4 walls are just gone. The governor of Mykolaiv says 8 cruise missiles slammed into the port city. This 5-story building, a non-military target, blasted open. For more than 6 hours, crews carefully sifted through the rubble. They could hear screams for help. Eventually, an 11-year-old was taken out alive. As he was being moved to an ambulance, he pointed to the sky and said, "Drone," possibly trying to warn those around him. The child later died in hospital. People fear drones. They're loaded with explosives and used by both sides. Ukrainian officials say an Iranian-made drone, often called kamikazes, similar to this one, struck an infrastructure site in the capital region, but no details were shared. For the 4th consecutive day, people in Kyiv woke up to air raid sirens, and they continued into the evening.
It is equally concerning.
The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency talked over one of those warning sirens, acknowledging the fragile state of Europe's largest nuclear plant.
There are days where things seem to be more calm, but then the next day we are again on a blackout.
Twice this week, the plant was forced to switch to diesel backup power. There are now 4 independent observers at the Zaporizhzhia plant as the head of the agency meets with both sides, hoping to convince them to set up a protection zone. Russia signaled it is open to the idea, but also claims the facility as its own after illegally annexing the area. While Ukraine urges the world to isolate Russia, Vladimir Putin was in Kazakhstan, pitching his Turkish counterpart on building an energy hub. Crystal Goomansingh, Global News, London.
The Biden administration says there will be consequences for Saudi Arabia deciding to cut oil production. The U.S. accuses Saudi Arabia of coercing other OPEC members into making the move. Today, Saudi Arabia pushed back, saying the Biden administration had asked the oil cut to be postponed by a month, which could have staved off price rises at the pumps until after the midterm elections. A cut to global oil supply will likely keep prices high, and that could benefit Russia, an OPEC member. The International Energy Association says OPEC's cut in production, along with inflation and interest rate hikes, could be the tipping point for a worldwide recession. Life in one of the world's poorest countries, what Haitians are dealing with and why they're asking for help. That's coming up. There are lots of warnings about food insecurity in the poorest parts of the world. Well, one of those is Haiti. Nearly half that country's population doesn't have enough to eat. And as Mike Armstrong explains, there are pleas for the world to help.
It is a country in chaos. Haiti has known trouble before, both natural and man-made. But many say this is worse than it's been in decades. This man took to the streets, he says, over unemployment, inflation, and insecurity. The The situation has gotten worse week by week. Public transportation is paralyzed. Schools are closed. Businesses are shutting down. Fuel, food, and even clean water are harder and harder to find. The World Food Program is struggling to help. It recently lost more than $8 million worth of aid. Enough food to feed more than 200,000 people was stolen.
2 of our 4 warehouses were deliberately targeted, looted, and pillaged.
Another growing problem is cholera. There have only been 18 confirmed deaths, but more than 250 suspected cases. That as hospitals can barely stay open. Some have gone public saying if a patient needs surgery, they should bring fuel to run the generator. Now, it was under those conditions the acting prime minister made this appeal to the international community. Ariel Henry is asking for military intervention by countries like the US and Canada to fight the gang problem paralyzing the country. Well, that request pushed more people into the streets to protest. Foreign intervention, critics say, has been tried and failed.
We keep doing the same thing.
Mathias Pierre is the director of elections and part of a group calling for a new interim government and dialogue. If the international community wants to help, he says, it can support Haiti's struggling police force with weapons and pay.
We have 13,000 police officers. They need to be equipped.
While Haitian police are still waiting for new armored vehicles from Canada, delivery has been delayed. Spokesperson for Global Affairs Canada, meanwhile, tells Global News Ottawa is still considering the Haitian Prime Minister's appeal for help. Mike Armstrong, Global News.
A resurgence in COVID-19 ahead, the latest variants to start spreading. Winter is approaching, and that means what was feared is in fact happening. The number of cases of COVID-19 are on the rise. Hospitalizations across the country are rising too, reaching levels not recorded since May in some places. The bulk of those patients are in Quebec, Ontario, and Alberta. The cases are largely being driven by a subvariant of Omicron. And as Jamie Morocker explains, a lack of restrictions, waning immunity, and the threat of new mutations could fuel a prolonged surge this fall and winter.
Updated COVID-19 vaccines now available to most Canadians target the COVID subvariants still dominant here. But health experts are now warning the virus is changing.
Mutations are happening at any time, randomly in any part of the world. We see now that the new variants or subvariants that they are popping now, they are basically escaping the immune system.
In Europe, the return to normal life has sparked the start of another wave. Seen as a marker for what North America can expect next, this U.S. expert is watching the climbing cases closely.
This time, the picture is a bit muddled because the rise of cases doesn't seem to be associated with any one particular variant. You are seeing a rise in BA.5, but you're seeing some of these new, I like to call them Scrabble variants.
Those variants have reached mutations in the hundreds. And while some die off without much concern, others have recently been added to a new watch list by the World Health Organization. In Canada, Omicron's BA.5 makes up the majority.
The BA.5 more closely resembles the new Scrabble variants than the original lineage. So you're more likely to get protected if you're getting that new bivalent booster.
Health Canada approved Pfizer's strain-specific shot Friday. This week, the company confirmed the vaccine generated a strong immune response, but it did not disclose the levels of antibodies. Moderna's bivalent booster has been approved since early September. Still, in the last 6 months, just 16% of Canadians have been boosted, leaving many prime doctors say to catch COVID again.
The best policy is to get vaccinated even if you had infection.
Advice that's only helpful if vaccines keep up with COVID year after year. Jamie Morocker, Global News.
A hockey heartwarmer next. The Habs fan finding some comfort in the face of a serious illness. If you're a hockey superfan, you know the drill. You buy all the gear and, most importantly, you watch every game. Well, lifelong Montreal Canadiens fan Kevin Murphy is all over that stuff, but he couldn't make this season's home opener. He's been diagnosed with cancer, and he couldn't leave his Toronto hospital. So instead, as Mike Drolet reports, his son brought the Habs experience to him.
Yes! These were the best of times for Kevin and Kavi Murphy. It didn't matter where they were when the Montreal Canadiens were playing. So long as they were together, life was good.
Me and my dad have always just been so tight, and we've always just bonded over everything. But hockey and the Habs have been one of the strongest ones for sure. And
it was like that from the day Kavi was adopted in India. You can see it in their pictures, the easy smiles between loving son and proud dad. But then, and there's always one of those, Kevin was diagnosed with kidney cancer in 2019. They thought they had it beat. But then...
It didn't really hit too hard until this summer. It was this summer when we were given the 6 months. And yeah, it's been really tough.
With Kevin in palliative care, Kavi went to the Hockey Hall of Fame to collect his thoughts. It's where his dad used to go all the time to see the statue of his favorite player, Ken Dryden. And there, under the statue, he knew what he had to do.
So I went home immediately, grabbed all our stuff, all our jerseys, all our figures, cards, and that night while he was asleep, I put them all up in his room.
Kevin woke up to this. He couldn't go to the Hall of Fame, so Kavi brought it to him.
He was kind of speechless.
Kavi sleeps at the hospital now. All the nurses know him. And if there's a game, father and son are watching it.
I want to be there with him and learn from him as much as I can before he's gone.
Where most would be inconsolable, Kavi shows a maturity beyond his years. I mean, how old are you?
I'm 17.
You don't seem 17.
Yeah, unfortunately, I've had to grow up pretty fast.
And no doubt his dad is proud of the man he's become. Mike Drolet, Global News, Toronto.
And that is Global National for this Thursday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's Your Canada is Crosskill Lake near Bridgetown, Nova Scotia. We'd love to see Your Canada. Please email it to us. And thanks for watching. Farah Nasser will be at the anchor desk tomorrow, and I'll see you Saturday at 7 for the new reality. Bye-bye.